How are you?
I hated that last assignment. I think it's got hell. Although it was very good.
Yeah. It was meant to be challenging.
By challenging, you mean annoying as hell.
I tried to deliberately make bugs that people make all the time, that I've made before. Because
what I did with your lack of tape, I didn't even figure out what the fuck was wrong. I just went to Google and recopy the name. I was just like, fuck, I don't care. Like, I don't even care. I'm loving Google's recruiter. I don't know what to do.
Oh, yeah. I don't think that should have been the problem, but there may have been an issue.
I was finding an error on the dollar sign function on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, for, no, document already.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Maybe the CDN was down. Yeah, it's possible. That was not one of the official bugs.
And maybe it was just me.
All right, welcome everybody. We're here in week number 6? 7. Week number 7. Wow.
In human speak, it's week 7. In zero index speak, it's week 6.
Okay. All right, cool. Good to know. Thank you, Paul. So last week we were talking all about AJAX, right, and making HTTP requests from JavaScript in order to get data from some backend somewhere into our web app front-end applications. We're going to continue on that theme pretty much this whole week, but we're going to talk about more formally how do we use these AJAX requests to create applications, more sophisticated applications, and how do people document these HTTP requests so that we can communicate between developers. And the process for that communication is what we call an API. Okay, and we'll go into all about what that means. We'll look at different types of APIs. They're not just for AJAX, they're used in other parts of programming. In fact, we've seen some APIs already without actually calling them that, but we will now call them that and talk about what that means. And then we're going to do an exercise using an actual existing HTTP API, as we call it, to make a little weather app. And then finally, we're going to start on a pretty substantial lab that is going to take up at least half of this class and at least half of the next class. And maybe the whole next class, because we're going to kind of build on it one step at a time. My goal with this lab was to really create something that very much resembles an assignment that I've gotten, as a front-end developer, as a JavaScript developer in the real world. And so, I'll go into what that means in a little bit more detail once we get there. The first thing I wanted to do, here's the agenda. Like I said, we're going to spend a decent amount of time on this lab. It's going to be basically building an app from scratch. So I wanted to start with a little homework review. This homework was challenging. I intended that way. I gave you this disclaimer, and I don't know if everybody took note of it, but the code was not meant to be familiar. The whole idea was to give you some code that was a little bit out of your depth, so that you would really have to rely on those debugging tools in order to kind of figure out what was going on. And if you didn't find every bug, that's okay. The idea was to just start to get more familiar with those debugging tools, so that as you're going, you can spend less time staring at like a single a missing semicolon or something, and more time actually writing code. Right? That's the whole idea. But as a way of reviewing this, I'm just going to go ahead and do it quickly. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but ask questions as you have them. But I'll just go how I would have solved this, because I think maybe that would be sort of helpful. Right. Yeah.
I remember getting looking for an hour.
This is the whole point, right? Because the types of bugs that I've added here are all things that either I or people that I've worked with have written before and I've actually seen, right? These are all things that we really do, and thus we need to be able to start recognizing them and start using our tools in order to find them, hopefully, more quickly. All right, so let's take a look. I'm going to go ahead and open the homework assignment So here it is. This is how you got it when you first started. And if I go ahead and, if I go ahead and open it in the browser, well, the first thing we notice right away is, unlike the working version, we don't see those 3 columns. So right off the bat, we know something's wrong. So probably, our first bet is going to be to look into this debugger. And as soon as we open the debugger, we should always kind of draw our eye over here to this right-hand corner and see, okay, we've got some sort of red X going on. There's some sort of error, some sort of syntax or type or reference error that's causing our program not to run properly. So we'll go ahead and look at that first, and we're just going to tab over to the console. Okay, so I've got a syntax error, an unexpected open curly brace on index line 15. I can click this if I want. So, it's somewhere in this neighborhood. So I'll go back to my code and look at index line 15. And what do I notice here? Well, there's this first object here, this next object here. These are in an array, so they need to be separated by a comma. So that's pretty easy. Generally, these are the easy ones to find, right? The ones that sort of, come right out and jump and hit us in the face and say you've done something wrong. Those are sort of the easy ones to find most of the time. So I'll go ahead and refresh. Okay, still don't see anything. No red X's, but we do get a yellow triangle, which is generally just as bad. Right? In this case, it's just as catastrophic. And the reason we're getting a yellow triangle here instead of a red X is because this is actually happening inside of jQuery, and jQuery is just kind of raising it to our attention. And that's also why this error message is a little bit more verbose, we'll say. But like we talked about in class, we can still get some useful information out of this. It says task is not defined, reference error. Remember, reference error means that we're referring to a variable or something that we've named, but we haven't yet declared it, right? So if we're referring to a variable, we haven't yet said var variable name, right? This is most often like a typo, right? Something like that. Like we've misspelled it, a real variable name, or we misspelled it when we declared it, something of that nature. Or it could be a scoping issue, right? Maybe we've declared the variable in a local scope, but we're trying to reference it in a different scope, okay? And if we do that, we're also going to get this reference error because it's not defined, hasn't been declared in that scope that we're working in. So let's see what's going on here. This is in index line 36, column 14. So I'll go back to the code. Line 36. 13. Okay, so, and it says task is not defined. Okay. All right, so this code is a little unfamiliar, but I can see, I'm referring to this thing task here. I don't see any global variable task. There's no local variable task here. So clearly, like, I'm referring to something here that hasn't been defined. Now, I could figure this out if I knew exactly what filter was and how that works. That would be an easy way to figure this out. But another way to figure this out is like, well, what's it doing up here? This function looks pretty similar. And, oh, this function has a parameter task, right? So that would be a quick way to notice that I needed this. What do we call this function filter here? What kind of function is that? We'll talk about it more in a second, but what name do we give this type of function that takes another function as an argument? Exactly. So filter is a higher order function, right? Filter is a function. We know it's a function because we're calling it with these parentheses. And we know it's higher order because the argument that we're passing in is another function. Right, so filter is a higher order function. Well, we'll talk about it more in a second. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and look back at our page. Okay, great. We've got our things showing up now. That's a good sign. However, we've still got a yellow arrow down here, so let's go ahead and tend to this. Okay, so we've got cannot read add event listener of null, type error. Okay, cannot read add event listener of null, type error. Okay, so remember type error is when we're trying to use something like a function when it's not. Generally, that's what it is most of the time. And we can see this is on index line 103. So let's go ahead and take a peek. Okay, I come down here, line 103. Okay, well, interesting. This is a syntax we haven't really seen before, right? We've seen this. This is attaching an event listener, we know. Okay. Well, I mean, by its position and, you know, kind of by its terminology, we can kind of see, like, maybe this is doing something similar as those lines. Just so happens it is. This is how you attach event listener without jQuery. And so that's all this is doing. Now, it threw this error at line 103. But line 102 looks pretty much the same, and that didn't throw an error. So what's going on here? Does anybody know what the issue is? Yeah, exactly. This CSS selector here was just misspelled. And thus, when we try to add an event listener to it, that won't work because there is no element with this ID. So we can fix this by just fixing that spelling. And we'll save and go back to the browser and refresh. Okay, we're free of errors in the console. Let's try to play with some of this functionality. So we know we're supposed to be able to drag these things from column to column. We're supposed to be able to add one by typing it in there and clicking submit. We're also supposed to be able to load a random one from the server if we just hit that load button. So let's try these things. Oh, and delete them if we hit delete. Okay. So close. When I drag this, though, nothing happened. And if we looked in the console, we would see, well, there's another error in the console. And notice, every time I do this, this number to the left here increments by 1. Right? And what that's telling me is that it got the same exact message 7 times now. So when you ever see that sort of bubble number to the left, that means I've gotten the same exact message 7 times. Or however many times in the bubble. Okay, so what's the error? Uncaught type error. So somebody remind me, what does a type error mean? We just saw one. Anybody remember what a type error means? Nobody? Yeah.
It's that you're referencing something as if it was
Exactly. It means we're trying to use some value as if it were some type when it's actually another type. And 90% of the time when we see this, it's because we're trying to use something like a function that isn't a function. That's what it is almost every time we see this. It's going to be that. And in this case, it's saying column.length is not a function, right? So this is what's happening. We're trying to use something, column.length, like it's a function, when in fact it isn't a function. What is column.length? What value type is column.length? Yeah. Okay. What data type specifically? Is it a string? Is it a function? It's a number, right? Yeah. So it's a number attribute on this column object, whatever that is. So we know if we put those parentheses at the end of length, that means we're trying to call it like it's a function. Well, it's not a function. It's just a number. So we need to remove those parentheses. Okay, let's go ahead and try that again. I'm just going to refresh and drag hello. And what do you know? That works. Excellent. Okay, what should we try next? Okay, let's delete. So I'm gonna press this red X, and what we would expect to happen, right? Is we would expect this card to disappear, and these 2 cards would remain. Correct? That's what we expect when we hit that red X. Let's see what actually happens. Okay, that wasn't quite right. Look at that again. I'm going to try to delete this exclamation point one. What happens?
Deletes everything about the one you're
Right, it's deleting every card on here except the one that I wanted to delete. Okay. Now, if I were really perceptive, I might say that it's doing exactly the opposite of what I want it to do. Okay. Now, I may not pick up on that right away, and that's okay. That's why we have these debugging tools. It's because we're not going to necessarily know just by looking at some behavior exactly what's going on. That's the whole point of the debugging tools. But what we can do is we can start, we can find the place where the event listener is happening for that event. So when we hit that red X, we know that the way that JavaScript works is there's some event listener function that's running as a result of that click event. We need to locate that place in our code, and we need to set a breakpoint there so we can step through line by line and see what's happening. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm going to go back here for a second just so we can identify where this is. Again, this code is pretty complicated, but you know, it's still organized this model view controller way that we've seen in previous classes. So I know where the event listeners are set up. They're set up in the controller. So I'm going to go down here to the controller, and I can see, okay, it looks like right here in this function, we're setting up some event listeners. So I need to identify the specific event listener that we're interested in for the delete action. And if I look at these, well, this should jump out at me. It's got the word delete in there twice. This is a click event listener delegated from the element with the Kanban ID, looking for elements that have a delete class. Right? So click events on an element with a delete class. And as a response to that click event, it's going to run this event listener handle delete. Okay, so, well, I don't know where this is, so let me look for this. So this, I know, is a function somewhere in this file. So I'm going to look for, I'm just going to Command F, handle delete, and I find this function here on line 113, handle delete. So I know that this is the function that's supposed to run when I hit that red X, right? We identified where we set up the event listener, and we found the event listener itself. Okay, so this is the function that's supposed to run when we hit that red X. So I don't know, where to go from here. So instead of, trying to figure out and read the code from here, I'm just going to set a breakpoint right here at line 114, and then, step through the code and see what happens. So I'm going to go to the Sources tab, open up the JS directory here so I can find my JavaScript file. And I remember that that was line 114 I was just looking at. Okay, and there it is. There's the handle delete function that we know is supposed to react to the red X click. Can somebody tell me why I'm putting it on line 114 rather than, say, putting it on line 113? Exactly. You're exactly right. On line 113, I'm defining this function. Okay? On line 113 is just defining the function. That line actually will run as soon as the file loads. It's not going to run when we click that red X. The first line that runs when we click that red X is this line here, line 114. Yes?
Would the ending parentheses like 117 also run when we close?
It sort of depends. Most of the time, that breakpoint will hit right before this function finishes. So it would actually hit, each time we run this function. But it kind of depends on how your code is formatted. Sometimes Google makes Chrome makes some assumptions. So it depends. But most of the time, it's going to actually stop every time you run the function rather than only when the page loads. But here we don't really know what's going on here. So I'm just going to put my breakpoint there. And now, in order to start debugging, I'm going to just trigger that event. Well, first I'm going to reload the page so we get new ones. So I'm going to trigger this event, and I know how to trigger this event by pressing that red X, right? That should run this event listener function. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to press this red X, Okay, we've hit my breakpoint. The screen's sort of grayed out. I can see the pause button. I can see this heavy blue line there saying that, okay, we're stopped. Okay, so far nothing's happened in our function. Remember, when we have this blue line here, this is saying I'm about to run this line, not that I have run this line already. So it's saying I'm about to run line 114. So let's let it run line 14, tongue twister. Now, if there's multiple things happening on the same line, sometimes it takes a couple clicks on the step over button. Okay, I can see, okay, I've got some variable here with an ID, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's interesting. And I can kind of infer maybe that's the ID of like the task that I was clicking on or something. It may be hard to say. All right, this delete task is clearly a function, right? We're using, at the end here, we're using these parentheses to call it. It's a function, and we're passing it that ID. So instead of stepping over this, I'm going to actually step into it, okay? So remember, this button would step over this line and go to line 116. Instead, I'm going to hit this button next to it to step into that delete task function. So here we go. Now we're at line 57, up here in the model, inside the delete task function. Okay, now this code is new and different, but we can kind of make sense of it by using our debugger tool. So it's over here, there's something called this.tasks, and it's assigning it a value, right? This is an assignment operator, so we know this.tasks is being assigned some value, and the value is the result of this function, whatever that is. Okay? So let's go ahead and look over here and see, all right, what is this.tasks? Well, this we can see is an object. Again, most of the code in here is stuff we're going to talk about next week when we go back into some more advanced JavaScript topics. So, you wouldn't have necessarily known what this meant, but you don't have to. It's going to show it to you right here. It's this object. So I'm going to open up that object, and I can look inside. I can see it's got some stuff. One of the things it has in there is this tasks key, and the value at that key is an array. So I'm going to go ahead and look what's in there. And if I open it up, it's got 3 objects. It's an array with 3 objects in it. The first one, okay, this is the ID 1, 2, 3, 4 status to do, which probably refers to like which column it's in, and the text hello, which is the actual text we see on the page. And this next one is world. It's in status doing 4, 2, 3, 2, 1. Right, so this array is really the model of our data, right? I mean the data for our model. And we can see what that is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to step over this line, and I'm going to see what this tasks is after this reassignment here happens. So I'm going to hit the step over. And now, if I look in at this tasks, well, I see it's an array that only has 1 item in it now. Okay, and that 1 item is the item that I clicked on. Okay. Okay, well, this shouldn't come as any great surprise. Well, we knew that's what was happening. But now at least we've identified where the problem is. We know the problem must be here. So it's somewhere in here is the problem. Okay? Well, a couple things we could do now. What data type is this.tasks? Well, we just saw it in the debugger, right? What data type is it? Array. Yeah, it's an array. This.tasks is an array. We just saw it in our debugger. We looked in there. It's an array that had 3 things in it, right? So over here, we're saying this.tasks.filter, right? So this must be a function for arrays, okay? So what I could do is I could go to Google and say, okay, what does array filter do? Okay, turns out filter is a built-in JavaScript function for arrays. Okay, so this isn't something defined here in this program. That's a like for each, okay, or other functions like that. It's something that's part of all arrays. So we could do that, or we could harken back to that observation we made at the beginning and say, okay, well, this is basically doing the opposite of what we wanted it to do, right? Instead of deleting the one we clicked on, it's deleting all of the ones except the one we clicked on, okay? And we know it's somewhere between here and here. And this function is returning this comparison, ID equal to task ID. So as an experiment, well, we know it's the opposite. We could negate this operation and make this operation do the opposite of what it's doing. So let's go ahead and try that. What is the opposite of an equality check of a triple equals? Yeah, exclamation mark equal equal, right? Not equal. So let's go ahead and try that. This is on this line 58. So I'm just going to invert this comparison. Now if you kind of look at this and read the English and kind of make sense of it, what we're doing is we're taking this array and we're filtering out some items. Filtering out some items. What we're telling it to do originally is we're telling it to filter out all of the items except for the one that has the ID equal to this one that we're passing in. What we're telling it to do now is filter out all the ones that don't have this ID. Right? So the only one we're removing is the one with that ID. Okay? But we don't really need to know all of those things in order to fix this. So we'll go ahead and refresh. And I'll go ahead and step through this again. And I'll step into our delete function. And when I step over this filter now, if I look at this.tasks, well, great, there are two things in there now instead of just the one. And the one that I clicked on is now gone, which is exactly what we wanted. So I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint. Did I already get rid? No, I guess not. And we'll just try it again. Wonderful. Now it works. Okay, let's quickly move through the rest here. I'm going to try to add a new one. Oh, what just happened there? That was weird. Okay. Test. When I submit it, something happens. I don't know what's happening exactly, but I can see that it's not being added. So that's really the crux here. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to do exactly what we did for delete. We're going to find where that event listener is attached, and then we're going to set a breakpoint. So if I go in here, I'll go down to the controller where I know the event listeners are attached, and I can find the one that's supposed to handle the submission of that form. And that's this one here. Add task form. On the submit event, it's going to run this function, handle submit. So let's find that function. I'm going to Command F. Go find it. Oh, conveniently, it's right here. Okay, so I don't know what this thing's supposed to do, but I'm going to go ahead and put a breakpoint here at line 107 and just see what happens. So I'll go back into my sources tab. I'm going to find line 107 this time and put a breakpoint there. Okay, let me try to add a new thing. Test. Okay, great. I've hit my breakpoint. That's good. Okay, I'm preventing the default here. I'm going to go to the next thing. Okay, now I'm getting that value that I entered out of the input. Okay, I can see over here on the right-hand side, it's test like it should be. That's what I typed in. Okay, let's step into this. All right, it's just pushing onto this array a new object. Let's step over that and look at this tasks again. This.tasks. I can see there are 4 things in there now. The fourth of which is my new thing. It has the test text. That looks good. So I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to render. Let's take a look at this. Oh, weird. There it is. I thought this wasn't working. Okay, so I'll just hit play. And then it disappeared. If you are very perceptive, you might even notice the screen kind of flickered when it disappeared. So what's happening there? It's resetting every time. Yes. And why is that? What do forms do by default?
They're naughty.
Yeah, they're naughty. In what way?
That they reset when you hit the submit button.
Correct. This is a form performing its default behavior, right? When a form is submitted, by default, it just refreshes the page. And so we saw it like doing everything right, and all of a sudden everything was gone. And that was because the page was refreshing. But like I could have sworn, looking at this code, that we have an event prevent default. So I may or may not notice right off the bat what's wrong with this line. If not, I could look around in other parts of the code and see where we use prevent default. Or I could just Google like how do I prevent default event in JavaScript. And eventually I would determine that event prevent default is a function and it needs to be called. And here we're not calling it, we're just referring to it. So we have to call that function. And when we do, we'll see that new thing stick. Okay, so now that new one sticks and we can drag it around just like the others. We can delete it. Okay, we're almost there. Now let's just try to load something and then we'll be done. Okay, well, that didn't work. Did anybody really expect it to work on the first try? No. All right, let's look. We've got a red X again, so let's take a look. Cannot read property for each of undefined. Okay, this is great. It's telling us exactly where the problem is. It's in index.js at line 142. So I'm going to dive in there. And okay, I'm doing something here. This is in a Ajax callback function, right? So we're here using jQuery's .ajax function in order to load something from a server, and we're passing it this success callback function. So a function to run when it's successful. Now it's saying that for each is not a function. So I don't know what's going on there because I know that for each is a function on arrays. So I feel like this should work, but it's not for some reason. So I'm going to set a breakpoint there at line 142 and see what's going on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why is success
It's hard to say. Yeah, it's probably because it's a function. Like Sublime has just
triggered something wrong with it?
no. Sublime's coloring scheme just sometimes is hard to predict. I mean, occasionally it does mean something. Yeah. So I mean, it's always a good idea to take a closer look. But in this case, it's just blue because the value is a function, probably. Because you'll notice that handle load is also a key in an object, and its value is a function as well, and it's blue. All right, so let's set a breakpoint there at line 142. Oh, I even got a nice little red underline this time. That's nice. Okay, let's try it again. I'm going to load. Okay. So over here, I can see this data thing. Okay, I can see this data thing that I'm referring to here. Cool, I'm going to look inside there. What do I notice when I open this up? What do I notice when I open that up? So, oops, oh man, I went one too far. I've got this data thing here. What am I looking for inside of that data object? Tasks. Right, I'm looking for something .tasks, right? So this assumes that data is some sort of object that has a key tasks, right? That's what this code is assuming. But what do we notice about data when we look at it over there in the debugger? What value type is data? Yeah, it's an array, right? You see data here? It's saying data is an array. So this is saying, which means it can't have a dot tasks because it's not an object. In fact, the data is the tasks itself, right? So this data array is what we want to be looping through, not data.tasks. There is no dot tasks inside of that data. So if we were to look inside of this first thing in that data array, we'd see, okay, well this looks like the to-do itself, or the task itself. Okay? So again, this data, I can hover over it over here, and I can see, oh, this is an array with one thing inside of it. There's no dot tasks inside of that thing. So there's clearly something wrong with my code. So remember, dot notation is used to access keys in an object, right? Not indexes in an array. So what I can do is I can go back in here, and I'm just going to assume that I can remove this because data is an array. So data.forEach should work, whereas data.tasks is going to be undefined. And if I try to for each through undefined, I'm going to get an error, like I just saw. So I'll go ahead and refresh, and I'll try to load. Okay, let me try to step over this line and see what happens. Okay, no errors, no red X's. That's good news. And what happens when I press play? We got a new card there, but this doesn't look quite right. Right? Something wrong with that. So we need to look at this a little closer. Let's look at where we're actually modifying the model this time. So I'll load again. I'm going to set another breakpoint here. And the reason I need to set another breakpoint here is because this is a callback. This is a function that's being passed into for each, right? So I can't just step over into that function. It won't work. When I go to step over, it'll actually go to this line here, to 145. So what I want to do instead is I want to set a breakpoint inside of that and hit play. And now I'm here. Okay. I'm going to model add task. Okay, I don't know exactly what that does. Let me step into it. Right, that's a function. I'm going to step in. Now that I'm here, okay, I'm trying to push onto this tasks array something that has the text. Therein lies the problem. This text is that whole object and not just the text part of the task. So when I put this text into this object and push it onto the array, the text is going to be an object, which is what we're seeing up there, instead of the text itself. So the way I'm going to fix this is in Sublime. Instead of putting the whole task object into this function, I'm going to put just a task.text. So let's take a look at it again. So we have this data array here. Each of the objects inside of this data array, even though there's only one object, each of the objects has two keys, completed false, and text is some text. Okay? So when we loop through that, each time we run this function, the task is going to be one of those objects. One of the individual items inside of the data array. And it has two keys, completed and text. Well, when we want to pass some text into this model add task, we're going to access just the text key there and pass that in. And so now we see the actual text there instead of object. Okay. Questions?
Do we, inside the function that we call on the data, say like if data not included equals false, that it don't have it?
Totally, you could do that, yeah. We could do that right, oops. We could do that right here inside of this function. We could say if task, so you know the task has two keys, completed, actually let me say if it's not completed, right? If it's not completed, then let's add it. So now we'd only add the tasks that have been completed. Yeah.
Does it matter on line 140 that you only have one forward slash after each?
Yeah, that was supposed to be a bug, but it turns out that Chrome doesn't care.
Yeah.
Other browsers, you may not be so lucky, but in Chrome, for whatever reason, it didn't care. So I added that bug and then found out that it worked for everybody without fixing it. So you're welcome. Great question. Yeah, I mean, this is not a proper URL. It should have 2 slashes there. But Chrome does this for a lot of things. It's going to kind of guess what you meant and take its best stab at it. So sadly, that didn't work. The bug had a bug, as Paul said. Any more questions? Again, the code here is more advanced than we've looked at, right? So if you're not comfortable with all the code, that's okay. Really what I wanted you to get familiar with was like setting a breakpoint, stepping through code, and watching those values change over there. Or use a console log to log the value of variables at different points in time, and things of that nature, because those are really key skills. And actually, this will probably happen, if you continue in this field, this will definitely happen to you, where you go into a code base that's unfamiliar, and you have no idea what's going on. You have to use these tools to kind of make sense of it in some way. And so, these are very valuable skills. So even if you weren't able to squash all of the bugs, getting comfortable with the tools is really the point. More questions? Okay, let's move on to the actual material. I'm gonna go ahead and close this. I'll post the solution for that after class tonight, so you can refer back to it. Okay, so today we're going to talk about APIs. Okay, and what an API is an application programming interface. Okay, big fancy word. The metaphor that we typically use to describe an API is a contract. Okay, so the way to really think about this is if you're working on, say, a construction project, you probably have several subcontractors that are responsible for different parts of the project, right? So you'll have one company that's probably responsible for, say, plumbing, and maybe another company that's responsible for the cabinetry or whatever it may be. Well, between those two subcontractors, they're going to have to come up with a contract that says, we agree that the size of the sink will be exactly X inches wide, or whatever it may be, right? And so rather than say, here are all the details of how we're going to implement all of our plumbing, they're going to say, here's the parts that are applicable to you, and the parts that you need to know about so that you can work with us. Okay. So we talk about APIs as being contracts between two programs, right? So it's describing how two programs can communicate with each other. Okay? It's really documentation is what an API is. It's how do we document how to interact with this program? And how do we read that documentation and use it? So there are a bunch of different types of APIs. And we've encountered a couple of them so far already, like I mentioned at the top of the class. The first one we might talk about is like a language API. Okay. So we might say like, oh, there's a function in the JavaScript API, the JavaScript application programming interface, that allows you to take the absolute value of a number. Something of that nature. Okay? So what does that mean? It means there's a function that we can use, and we know what we need to give it, and we know what it needs to return, but we don't need to know how it's implemented under the hood. That information is not important to us. All we need to know is how to interact with it, right? So math.abs for absolute value, knowing that that's a function and that it takes a number and returns the absolute value of that number, that is the API. How it works underneath the hood, like how it actually creates that absolute value, that's not information that we need. And in fact, that may change over time to become more efficient or to become more concise or whatever it may be. So the implementation details are kind of hidden from us. What we know about is the API, the application programming interface. So in a language, what this usually means is, okay, what functions are available in that language out of the box, and what parameters do those functions take? What values do those functions return? And generally, what is the function supposed to do? In sort of English description, what does this thing do? So that's how we might describe the API of a language. And we've seen several of these things. Right? Math.pal is a function in JavaScript that takes two number parameters, and what it does, it returns a single number value, and it takes the first number and raises it to the power of the second number. Okay, and here is what the JavaScript API looks like. Okay, well, you might see it on MDN, you might see it on W3 Schools or some other website, or you might look at the actual ECMAScript specification and read that. That's where it's that's the most official place you could find the API, but this is good for most purposes. This is telling us math.pal is a function that returns the base. Base to the exponent power, right? So the description of this function, a description of the parameters that this function takes, and a description of the return value that this function gives. In this case, returns the base to the exponent power. And MDN is nice because it also gives you some example usage. Right? Notice what we don't see here is we don't see how math.pal is implemented in JavaScript. Right? Somewhere in the language it says math.pal is a function that takes two parameters, does something with them, and then returns the result of those parameters. We don't see that in the API. That's implementation detail. That's not part of the API, and it's not something that we really need to know about. Okay. We can look at another one. Another JavaScript API would be like document get element by ID. We talked about when we first started manipulating the document object model, the DOM, we talked about, well, there's this native JavaScript way of doing this without jQuery. We would call this the document API or JavaScript API for manipulating the DOM. And again, this is just describing a function here that takes a ID parameter and returns a DOM element. Okay. So again, an API is just sort of a description of how to interact with some program. In this case, how to interact with the JavaScript language. Questions about JavaScript API? Or we've been sort of learning this as we go without actually calling it an API, right? Every time we use one of these, sort of built-in JavaScript functions, we're using its API, but we just didn't call it that until now. So now we have a name for it. Now, if they came out with a new version of JavaScript, and all of a sudden they changed the number of parameters that math.pal takes, now all of a sudden it takes 3 parameters for some reason. Well, if we are using that new version of JavaScript, all of our programs will break, right? Or any of them that use math.pal. And that's why we refer to this as a contract, right? Because we have this agreement with JavaScript that they're not going to change the way this function works, and and thus we can use it and in our programs without being scared of it breaking. Yeah.
So, are APIs libraries?
Generally speaking, they're descriptions of how to interact with some program, okay, or in this case, a language. So there are different types of APIs. This is what we'd call a language API. There's also what we'd call a library API. Okay? So how do we interact with a specific library? One that we've seen, kind of in a lot of depth at this point is jQuery, right? So how do we interact with jQuery? Well, one thing we talked about is the jQuery.ajax function. Okay. So the API describes, okay, there's this function. It takes these parameters, and it returns this value. Okay, so this is very much like a language API. Instead of being part of the JavaScript language, it's part of this jQuery library. So we can take a look at this JavaScript.ajax or jQuery.ajax. And here's the documentation for this API. Okay, so jQuery.ajax is a function. It takes a URL parameter and an optional settings object parameter. That's what those square brackets means. That means it's optional. And we could even look and see, okay, what should those settings have inside of them? Well, it can have this accept key, it can have an async key, before send key, cache key, complete key, contents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a pretty hefty API here. The AJAX function is very powerful and configurable. And then if we scroll down, we can see some example usage. So we can see here they're using it, passing it the settings object with a URL of this and a before send callback of this, whatever that is. Okay. So again, we've been learning about these APIs all along. We just weren't calling them that. The API part is a description of the function, what parameters it takes, and what it returns. And then we can talk about, generally, what does this do? Well, this performs an asynchronous HTTP AJAX request. Again, we don't really need to know or care about how this works, that jQuery.ajax works. When we actually pass that in, what does it do with it? How does it make that all those things happen? We could, if we're curious, we could take a peek because it's open source. But we don't really need to know that in order to interact with it, in order to interface with this library. Yeah.
So that is an API call or an API itself?
We talk about the API as being the description of all the things that we can use. Now, when people say API calls, what they typically are referring to is the third type of API that we're about to look at. So, yeah. It's sort of a strange terminology. It's kind of putting two things together that don't really go together, but a lot of people do refer to it that way.
Yeah.
Conflating, that's the word I was looking for. Okay, are we comfortable with language APIs and library APIs? There's nothing new here. We're just putting terminology to things that we've already seen, right? I mean, maybe we haven't read a bunch of this documentation yet, but that's a skill that we should develop over time. Like, how do we look at documentation and make sense of it? Yes?
Is it fair that, when it comes to library APIs, that they're just basically shortcuts or easy ways of doing things? You could potentially, theoretically,
yeah, so any library that's written in JavaScript must necessarily be able to be performed in JavaScript, right? Right. So yeah, a library is you could think of it as a shortcut, but oftentimes it's a little more sophisticated than just a shortcut. But yes, anything that's written in a library, well, I could just write that library myself, right? Find those functions myself. Yeah, exactly. But why would I do that if it's open source and somebody's already done it so elegantly, right? Good question. More questions before we move on to the third and most poignant type of API? Okay, I teased it. So the third type of API, the one that we're going to be interested in today primarily, is what we call an HTTP API. Okay. So this is very similar to how we think about library APIs and language APIs, but instead of thinking about functions, we think about URLs. Okay. So URLs and HTTP method combinations, they call those endpoints. Okay, so a get to this URL, that combination of things we would call an endpoint. So instead of thinking about functions, we can think about, okay, what are the endpoints? What are the URLs and methods that we can use? What, instead of function parameters, what query parameters, query string parameters can we pass to that endpoint? Or what data can we put in the body? And instead of like the JavaScript return value, what JSON response does that endpoint return? Okay. So instead of functions, we're talking about endpoints. Instead of function parameters, we're talking about query parameters or request bodies, some way of passing data to that endpoint. And instead of talking about JavaScript, return statements, we're talking about what JSON does this endpoint return. Again, endpoint is just a common term that's used to describe a combination of a URL and an HTTP method. Because a single URL can respond to multiple HTTP methods. We'll see what that looks like in a second. Questions about making this sort of analogy in your head? Okay, well, let's look at it a little more closely. Here is what some API documentation for an HTTP API might look like. Now, this is pretty simplistic, but we'll look at some real ones here in a second. So the first thing we're going to say is, instead of saying like the function name, like math.pal, we'll say, okay, what is the endpoint? Well, it's a GET request to some path API/user. Most API documentation will leave off the first part of the URL because it's the same for everyone, right? So if we're accessing, say, Twitter's API, everyone is going to start with api.twitter.com, and then the only thing that changes is the path, what comes after that part. So most of the time when we look at API documentation, it's going to have just the path portion. And then it says, what query parameters does this endpoint look for? In this case, user ID. How do we put query parameters onto a URL? Yeah. Right. Exactly. We put query parameters onto URL by appending on the end of it a question mark. The query parameter name equals query parameter value.
So in this case, would it be a question mark user ID equals?
Whatever the user ID is, precisely. Yep. And finally, it's saying, okay, if you submit that request properly, here is the JSON that I'm going to return. The JSON is going to look something like this, right? Generally, there will be fake data in there because the data will change based on the user ID, right? But they'll show you, what is the shape of the JSON that we're going to return in that request. Okay. Does everybody remember what JSON is? Can somebody explain what JSON is? Yeah.
It's extensive JavaScript object notation, and basically is a standardized method of passing information from the server to user.
Right, exactly. JSON looks very much like JavaScript objects, which is where it got its name, JavaScript object notation. And it's a form of communication. It's a data format that's used to communicate between servers and clients, browsers and server programs. Right?
Will it return historical data like that, or will it only return?
Will it return numbers?
Yeah.
Yeah. JSON numbers are valid JSON values. So strings, numbers, arrays, objects, and null and booleans are all fine in JSON. Only thing that wouldn't be would be like a function. You couldn't have a function in JSON. Okay, so let's look at some real API documentation. Oops. Let's take a peek at the New York Times API. So it's important to note that in web development, when people say APIs, they most typically mean this third type of API, an HTTP API. That's generally what they're referring to. You know, technically, JavaScript language has an API, and jQuery library has an API, and it's correct to refer to it that way. But when people say APIs, what they're generally talking about are these HTTP APIs. It's just sort of the most common use of that word. So let's take a look at the New York Times. So look, this looks pretty familiar, right? Very similar to what we were just looking at. This is an endpoint. It's a GET request to a path/lists. And it's saying dot. And this curly braces, it's using to say that thing can change. So that thing can be .json if you want it in JSON format. It could be .xml if you want it in XML format, et cetera, et cetera. Reading API documentation is a real skill, mostly because everybody documents it differently. Right? And we just saw looking at JavaScript on MDN, looking at jQuery on jQuery.com. They have very different ways of documenting those things. The same goes for HTTP APIs. Some of them will be documented really nicely and really well like this. Others will not be so nice. So looking at a bunch and seeing how it works. So let's look at the details for this first one, lists.format. Well, it's telling us, okay, what are the query parameters here? Well, it's saying the first one is list, and that's a string. So it's giving us an example. We can add a query parameter, weeks on list, and that's a number, it looks like. We can add a query parameter saying we only want the lists for this date. So we can say bestseller date, 1987-09-23. This is like a date format there. Another date for some reason. We can look them up by ISBN number, so like a library book number. You can look up by the date the book was published, etc. And there's all these query parameters that we could potentially use. And then over here on the right-hand side, this is showing us, okay, what does the JSON look like in the response? So again, this is an object, right? It's JSON has an object. There's a key status that's going to have a string value. There's a key copyright that will have a string value. Num results that will have a number integer value. Last modified string. And then there'll be this results array, right? This is an array with the square brackets. And then over here, each thing in that array is an object, which has a name, display name, bestseller's date, published data, etc. So which part of a response does the JSON live in? Well, thinking back to our HTTP introduction, which part of the response does the JSON live in? Is it the headers? Leading question. No, it's not the headers. It's not the headers. What are the headers for? Yeah, there is information there, but
Stuff like what type of coding type you're doing.
Exactly. The headers describe the sort of the metadata about the response or the request, whichever it is. So it might be like, how big is the JSON? That might be a header, but it wouldn't be the JSON itself. So I'm looking at. Exactly. It's in the body, right? This is the meat of the response. This is the part we actually care about. That's the body. The body of the response. That's where the JSON will live. Yeah.
The top one says bracketing of the HTTP address, just the end, how does it know what HTTP address to go to?
So it doesn't. We would never actually put just /lists in our AJAX call for this. What I was saying is that the documentation leaves it out because it doesn't change for all of these. It's always the same domain, right? It's always the same host and always the same protocol. So the part up until this point is the same for each of these. So they just leave it out so it looks cleaner.
And then with the question mark, the query parameters come right after lists, like list question mark date equals.
It would come right here, yep. Question mark, date equals. Again, do we use the question mark for every query parameter? I don't know if we mentioned this explicitly. If we have 4 query parameters, do we have 4 question marks? How many question marks do we have for 4 parameters? Yeah, just one. What do we put in between each of the individual query parameters?
Ampersand.
An ampersand, yes. So we need a question mark to say, hey, we're starting our query parameters now, but after that, each one, we can separate them with an ampersand. And query parameters, by their very nature, are generally optional, right? So we can use any or whichever ones of these we want to sort of parameterize our request. We don't have to use all of them, and most of the time we don't have to use any of them. Yeah.
How the API
So how does the API know? So the value that we give to the query parameter, the program that this request is going to is able to sort of extract that value from our query string and use it to create a response. So when we make that request, there's some server program, maybe it's a node program that looks at the request, looks at each of the query parameters, and uses their values in order to calculate its response.
So how would you write that?
Well, so it depends on what language you're writing it in, or I mean, if you're doing it in a very bare bones way, you could just look at the whole thing. You could say find the question mark, and then you could sort of just start find the next ampersand, and then kind of split it wherever the equal sign is. You can imagine how you could do this by just manipulating the string. But most times, the language that you're working in will have some convenience functions or some helper functions that will do that for you. Specifically, Node has a bunch of modules that you can use to do that. Okay, let's look at one more. Yeah, question.
Back to that. So if you type this in URL,
You potentially could if you wanted to, but we know that this endpoint here, this URL here, returns JSON. So if we type it into our browser, what are we going to see here in the browser? Yeah, we'll see JSON. And if we've installed the formatter, it'll be formatted nicely. But what we're probably going to use these endpoints for is what? Something that we've talked about recently. What have we been learning about in the past 2 classes? Yes, very true, accurate. So how do we make HTTP requests in our JavaScript programs? AJAX, right? Probably we're going to be requesting these endpoints by using AJAX, $.get, for instance, or $.ajax. So we'll be using that to access these things. Let's look at one more, and then we'll take a break. It's been a little over an hour. So here's Instagram's API. Again, looks very different than the New York Times, but there's a lot of common things going on here, right? First thing we notice, well, these look like endpoints, correct? This is saying a GET request to /media, /media ID, /comments. Well, if we request that, an English description of what we'll get is a list of recent comments on a media object. So we can click here, and it's showing a fully fleshed out example URL. So you'll notice that path that we see here is right there, but now it's got the full URL before it. So this is showing us, how would you make it. We also need a query parameter here called access token, whatever that means. And we can look at the response, and this is the JSON that this endpoint will return in its response. So all the same pieces, they're just kind of laid out a little bit differently in this Instagram documentation. You can see the response is going to be an object that has a data key. The value at that data key is what value type? It's an array, right? We know it's an array because it has these square brackets. Each of the items inside of that array is an object. Those objects will have a created time key, a text key, a from key, and an ID key, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that whenever we make a request to this endpoint, the object that's returned will have this shape, will take this shape. The thing that will change are these values.
Where do you put, so it requires an access token there?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that something you want to keep?
It probably is, but in certain authentication flows, it doesn't matter as much because it has to be coming from a certain browser and other things like that. So it may or may not be something that you have to have. All right. Any more questions before we take a break? Okay. After we do, we'll go. Yeah.
jQuery send requests JS on
Could we make a request to this using jQuery in a Node interactive session on the terminal?
Yeah.
No, we couldn't, as a matter of fact. And the reason for that is, first of all, jQuery is not really used in Node because it's primarily a front-end library, right? Its jobs are interacting with the DOM, which doesn't exist in Node, and its other job is to make AJAX requests, which actually don't exist in Node either. So the XML HTTP request object that we use in the browser is not there in Node. There's a different way for making HTTP requests. So no, we couldn't. However, we could in the JavaScript console in the browser. Make sense? Cool. All right, let's take a break, and then we'll come back and look at some of this stuff in practice. Yeah.
Question.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so guess what I have? Hey, look, it's all the latest features. It's when you go to 4,000.
Sweet.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So obviously, I just have to change what my actual request is. So that's my question. It's actually one. They put in the actual authorization in a different file. So if this does the actual authorization and then writes it to an authorization, then this looks for it in the authorization for required request. But I also want to require, I want to make sure that the authorization runs every time and stuff, just to make sure that it's related to their key, because you know, talking about the browser. So how do I do this? How do I run authorization before this?
Okay, so go back to authorization. What you need to do is here where what you have to do is you then have to export that.
So then I'm gonna,
So I'll tell you how to do it.
so I know it's export dot.
Yeah, generally it brings modules on exports equals.
So do I have to do it from this file?
From this file.
So
Because
then
what we
I
want to do is we want to give other people the ability to access this file.
module dot export and
It's module.export equals. So we're actually assigning it a value. So now we require the value that we get. So that will be a function. So we can call it.
So then I can, in this, obviously the app runs when you reached it, so that I would just run from, I would just run
But yeah, but you called it.
Twitter or like that.
So the name that you give it here doesn't matter. The name that matters is the one of the variable that you assign.
Oh, so it would just be OAuth, like that.
Yeah.
And then my next question is, how would I write it? My next obvious step is I now need like a normal JavaScript that runs in the browser and calls this. How do I do that?
Also, first you'll need to have your server configured to serve both files.
There's like, yes.
You can make Experience Express.
Yes.
You can make Express serve both files and yeah.
Okay.
Basically, you tell it that, okay, here is a folder where all of our static is. Make a request to that folder, give your instead of running else. So you configure that here in your server.
I'm using it, so it's just assuming it's apps.
Yes.
Because that's how I express that.
Exactly. It'll be apps.
So I would just configure as files and JSON.
So this will be a place to start.
Okay, yeah. Sorry if I interrupted the question. Yes, now I know how to run modules. Sorry.
Oh crap.
I don't know either, because I've never paid full price.
Yeah.
And when they were all individual jobs, they were all individual
This is like,
I had to go in and sign up. Then you look. So then I
So, and then this is what
like it just came up like even in the chicks. So
But the
I was like going there.
Awesome. So now I understand how servers and files.
Alright, sorry about that.
So it does the function that I want.
Okay. Let's take this stuff and start using it. All right, so one more topic we do have to talk about, a couple small more topics before we actually dive in and start using this. Mostly some terminology stuff here. Just because you're going to see this term a lot, I want you to at least be somewhat familiar with it. REST. Has anybody heard this term before? Like, a lot of times when we're talking about APIs, someone will say, we're going to make a REST call, or we're going to use a REST API. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It's just a way of designing your HTTP API. Okay, So it's most important for, say, a backend developer who's actually creating this HTTP API, but understanding generally what it means it is helpful, even for JavaScript developers, front-end developers. Okay, so REST, it's a way of designing those endpoints so that they're not just sort of arbitrary, paths and query parameters and things like that. There's actually some pattern to it. And this is what that pattern looks like. So here we have a set of endpoints. Okay, this first one is saying get to API user, and this last part, when you see, sometimes people will wrap it in curly brackets, some people will put this colon in front of it. That means this is can change. This is a variable sort of part of the path. Okay, so not only can we have query parameters that parameterize our paths, our requests, but also we can change parts of the path to request different things. And so here we're making a GET request for API user ID. So we're requesting the data for some user with some user ID. Right? Because remember, a GET is a read request. This next endpoint is a POST request to API user. And what do we think this endpoint is used for? Anybody over here have an idea? What do you think this POST API user endpoint is used for? Exactly. This endpoint, this POST API user, this is an endpoint we might use when we're creating a new user for our application. Okay, because remember, POST maps to create. POST means create. GET means read, POST means create. What about this put request? What do we think this one's doing in our application? Yeah. Exactly. This one is updating some user with some user ID. So maybe we want to change the email address for some user in our application. We could create a put request to this URL in order to make that happen. Okay. Finally, what does this last one do? Somebody who's brave. Yeah. Exactly. This last endpoint here deletes the user with that user ID, just like it sounds. So taken together, we would call this set of endpoints a resource. Okay. This is the user resource. It's a set of endpoints that are used to modify the user or update the user or get the user or delete the user. So it's a set of user-related endpoints. Taken as a collection, we would call them a resource. And this way of designing HTTP APIs is called REST, representational state transfer. Now, there are a whole bunch of sort of theories behind REST and what it means actually in the back end and all those things, but just generally speaking, it means designing your endpoints in this way, in resources. So if we look back at Twitter, say, or sorry, Instagram, here we've got a GET request for /comments, a POST request for /comments, and a delete request for /comments comment ID, right? This is a resource. This is the comments resource that we're looking at here. So we would call this a REST API. Yeah, so what they're saying is you're not allowed to update a comment. So if you're an Instagram user, that probably sounds familiar, I guess. Okay? So just mostly terminology here, but this is generally how most APIs that we'll interact with HTTP are organized and how they work. Okay, finally, we're just going to talk about this sort of briefly, but most APIs, when we interact with them, require some type of authentication. Okay, so if we try to make a request right now to the New York Times API, it wouldn't work because we're not authenticated to do so. And so in order to get that authentication, there's a couple ways that most APIs will use. The first way is kind of the simple way, which is by using an API key. Okay? How this usually works is you just go to their site, you say, hey, I'm making this new application, you register it, and they'll send you an email that has some big long string of text that is the API key that you can use. Okay, so it's a big long random thing that's unique to you and unique to your application. And we can usually just put that on the end of our request with like a query string or something. And each API will kind of specify its own way of doing that. Now, that isn't adequate for some APIs. Okay? So for New York Times, it's probably perfectly fine to use API keys. However, for something like Instagram or for Facebook or Twitter or things that are social networks, we have to use a different type of authentication called OAuth. OAuth just means it's an open authentication standard that's used by all of these APIs in one form or another. And what this does is it allows us to authenticate our application on behalf of some user. So what this allows us to do is somebody can come to my site, we can authenticate using OAuth, and then all of a sudden my application has access to their Facebook data. Right, so you've seen this where you go to log in with Facebook, it'll take you to Facebook, it'll say X and Y application wants access to your profile, your comments, your user history, whatever it may be. You say, okay, that's fine, send everything, and then it'll take you back to the application, and now you're in, right? That sort of authenticating on behalf of the user, that is called OAuth. And we'll talk about that in more depth next class, but these are the two ways that we might authenticate. So the reason we need OAuth is because we're accessing user data on a separate platform, right, on a separate service. So anytime the service we're interacting with is sort of like a social network or somewhere where the user might have stored data, right, then that's probably going to require OAuth in one form or another. Okay. All right, so now we're going to do an exercise and start putting this stuff into practice. In order to do that, though, we're going to have to get the starter code. So let's open the terminal. You already know what you're doing. Go ahead. Feel free to jump ahead and do this. But I'm going to walk us through it here. First thing I'm going to do is just cd enter, make sure I'm in my home directory. And then I'm going to cd into documents. Do a quick ls, just see what's going on. Okay, I'm going to change directory into my JSD2. Then I'm going to do a git pull to get the latest updates to that repository. Okay, I'm up to date. I'm going to cd up one directory. And then make a new directory, make dir, inside of my named repo, my Jacobs.js repo. And I'm going to call it class 12. Then going to copy the starter code, cp-r, js-dc2, 12/APIs or -APIs, starter code. Move that trailing slash. And I'm going to copy that to my named repo, class 12 folder. So just copying the starter code from the class repo to my new folder. Hit enter there. And then once I got that, I'm going to cd into my named repo, class 12, starter code. And this in Sublime. Double dot. And actually open a new window, so it's over here. Okay. So there's only one folder inside of there, and that is Weatherify. First, I love my fun names. So let's take a look at this. I'm a little bit too zoomed in, it seems. What we have here is an application. It looks like we've got a template down here. Got some stuff here. Let's look at the JavaScript. Oh, it looks like we have some JavaScript too. So I'm going to open this in the browser just to see what it looks like. Okay. So here we have sort of the skeleton of an application. All we're going to do is we're going to take this existing application and we're going to integrate an API. And in this case, we're going to integrate with an API called Open Weather Map, which allows us to get real-time weather from any part of the world. And so what we do is we type in a city name here, we type in a country name here, a country code, sorry, like US, country code there. And then when we submit this, what we want to do is we want to make a request to that Open Weather Map API, a GET request probably because we're reading some data. And then we want to put it into our model so that we can display it here on the page. Okay? So let's take a look at the code. Oops. Looks pretty familiar. Up top here we have a model. It's an object that we've stored in this weather variable with a few keys: city, country, temperature, description, humidity, clouds. Okay. So notice this is our view is a little bit different than we've seen it before. Anybody want to guess why I've done it this way? Well, I mean, the comment tells you, but if anyone wants to try to describe it, that would be cool. Yeah.
So that you're not using analytics or something, so you're using the same template.
Exactly. So notice what I've done here. I've created a global variable called template. And what I'm saying is, once the document is ready, run this function that finds our template and compiles that template and store it in this global template variable. So now this global template variable, as soon as the document ready, will have our template function in it. So what this allows us to do is now, when we want to render, we can just refer to this global variable. We don't have to repeat these two steps every time we render. And this actually will make our application a lot more efficient, because this compile step here, that's pretty expensive. It takes a lot of computing power to do that compilation, especially if our template is big. Then that can get so intense that we'll actually notice a lag in our UI. And so if we just do this once at the beginning, then we don't have to recompile it every time we render. So just a small efficiency gain here. Question?
If you're using various templates for being different buttons and rendering different things, do you suggest, since it takes an actual amount of time, do you suggest loading all of them in or displaying anything, or doing them as you go?
Probably it would be best to just do them all at the beginning. Because the amount of time that it takes at the beginning will sort of pale in comparison to loading all of the other assets and things of that nature. So it's just a good time to get it out of the way. I will say though, if we're super concerned about performance, there is a way with handlebars to do this whole step when we do what's called pre-compile it, before this even runs. So we can actually do it on our computer and just use those pre-compiled templates instead of actually doing it in our JavaScript. But we're not quite to the point where that's necessary. So yeah.
So if the variable template is holds that function, why does it say?
Because the function has been created. The part that takes time is creating the function. not calling the function. Calling the function is actually pretty cheap. Creating the function is the expensive part.
Oh, do you mean like labor or compute?
Yeah, thank you. That's jargon. Expensive is a way of saying it takes a lot of time. It takes computing power.
So I get that it saves like me time.
No, not you.
No.
It saves the program time.
Okay. What also saves me not to be read that?
Yeah,
Okay.
it might save you time as well. But the thing that is going to matter here is that it's going to save the program time, so that we won't see, the UI jitter if it's re-rendered a lot. That's what we might see if we're re-rendering frequently and we're compiling each time. All of a sudden, we might see the UI slow down and jitter and do weird things. So it saves us some time.
We've done this on the other program, or that was different?
No, we could have done this on all the ones we've seen so far. Yeah, we could have done this every time. I just, this is a little more complex, so I waited to roll this out until we sort of got that basic part. And if we had more than one template, maybe we have a few global variables here where we store the different templates that we're using in our application. So that's totally something that we can and will do. Okay. Also, our controller looks a bit different. I just wanted to show you some different ways of doing the same thing. Because I don't want to give you the impression that everybody follows this very strict pattern. They don't. And so it's important to be familiar with other ways of writing the same code. Here, we've written all of our controller inside of this document ready function. So now, instead of having like a setup function, we've just kind of put everything right here inside of this document ready anonymous function. And you'll see this a lot. A lot of people will do this where they put all their code or a big chunk of their code right there in the document ready. So as soon as the document's ready, we're going to render the view, and then we're going to attach this event listener. And once again, notice instead of referring here to some function that's defined later in the file, we're passing in directly a callback function. So an anonymous callback function right there is going directly instead of some function name. So just another way to write, basically the same thing that we've been doing. This is sort of just a different way that we'll often see. Okay, if we look at this code so far, well, we notice it's already done some stuff. It's already prevented that default action. Promise there are no bugs in this yet, so you don't have to worry about that until you start writing your own. On line 39 here, we're actually getting the value out of that city input. So out of the first input, we're getting the value out of the country input. And next, we have to do these two things. We have to make a request to open weather map API using $.get or $.ajax. So we need to make an AJAX request. We then, in the callback function, need to update the model. And then finally, we're going to re-render the view again. Because we've updated that model, we've got to get the view back in sync. So we got to render it. All right. So I'm going to let you do this on your own, but to get us started, let's take a peek at the Open Weather Map API together. So I will post this link in Slack, or if you're in the slides, there's a link in the slides. Okay, so if you look in the general channel, there's a link to this API documentation for Open Weather Map. Okay, so each one of these things is describing a different resource for the API. The one that we're going to look at is just this one, the current weather data resource. That's the only one we're going to care about. But before we do that, we need to get an API key. So if you read this here, our weather API is simple, clear, and free. We also offer higher levels of sort. Please see our paid plan options. To access the API, you need to sign up for an API key. So everybody click this link and follow the instructions to sign up and get your own API key. Is yours taking this long, or is this just me?
Got my API key already.
All right, we'll give everybody a few seconds. Okay. Anybody still working on getting an API key? Okay. So if we go back to this main weather API page, right, so the first open weather map page that I sent you, again, what we're interested in here is this current weather data resource. That's what we're interested in. That's the one that we're going to be using. So let's go ahead and click this API doc. That means this is the documentation for this API, this specific one. So click in there. And we'll notice, once again, they've used a completely different strategy to lay out their documentation. It just so happens that all of their requests are GET requests. They've left off like the method, for instance. They don't have that anywhere. They're showing the query parameters a bit different. But we can still kind of use the things we know about HTTP and making requests to kind of infer what this means. Right? So it looks like we can make requests to this URL, and we can send it a queue parameter with an equal sign, and then maybe the city name as a string, comma the country code as a string. And when we request that URL, we'll get some sort of result. If we scroll down here, it'll show you, okay, here's what the result looks like. So it's got this object. Again, this is sort of poorly formatted, but there's a chord key that has an object, on and that. There's a sys key that has some system information. There's a weather key that has, looks like some actual weather in there, and etc. Main key with the temp and the humidity. Okay. So now go ahead and with your API key, and also I'll note that it's leaving off the API key part of this call, but it does go on the query parameters. Do they show that anywhere?
If we click on their sample link and then replace the one with their API key, you'll get stuff.
Yeah. Right. So if you click those sample links, it'll show you what it should look like. You just have to replace this app ID with your actual API key. So again, in the documentation, if you click on those example links, it'll show you what that URL looks like in the browser. You could just replace it with your API key, and you should get back the JSON in your browser that it's supposed to return. All right, so go ahead and try to work this out, and come around. Either one, .get or Ajax are both perfectly fine. Whichever one you use. In this case, .get is a little bit simpler since we are making a GET request.
Do we want to do partial strings, or does it have to be like when we search?
Oh no, you want to just do it when they submit it, right? We don't want to do it like as they're typing. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm also asking, like, let's say they put plus.
Yeah.
Search bar.
Well, there's no way for us to verify that. I mean, we could, but it would be cumbersome. We're just going to trust that whatever they put in is valid.
All right. So
No validation.
No validation.
Not yet.
It's a easy one.
It's paired because of Adam.
So you can refer back to, like the homework that we just did or other examples of where we're using AJAX. Look at how it's done there. Know things we have to change. Obviously, we have to change the URL that we're using. We have to add in query parameters. We'll have to change that callback function so that instead of doing whatever it does, it updates the model in our application here and re-renders. Yeah, totally.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's a good time.
Seriously?
It's it helps open source.
Still not doing
If you're
nice.
feeling like really adventurous, you could even like practice test the API endpoint by using the curl command that we talked about in the HTTP class. You could curl, that URL, add your API key in there, and see what happens. See what the response is. Or you could just put it in the browser address bar, and then your browser should be able to format it for you. You can look at that JSON, see what it looks like. It's probably be easier than looking at the JSON in documentation because it's poorly formatted.
So did you want this to work for stuff outside the US? I mean, I assume you included country for a reason, otherwise I was just going to.
Well, I include the country because the API allows you to add the country.
Does the world exist outside the United States? That's my question. Do they have weather technology?
I've heard that they might, but I'm not sure.
No?
Can't say firsthand.
Blasphemy. Speaking of.
Don't even like all this.
Yes, I will wager. There may or may not be good. Specify which you-
Just gonna do it this way. Just gonna- Oh, we should probably.
Yeah, so you are just listening to what it is. So remember what the address type is.
Is this secure? Not secure.
Remember, when we type in a URL into our address bar, it's hiding an important part of this URL, a critical part of it from us. The first part, in fact.
And it's not secure, so don't worry about it.
Correct. It's just fine. So if you could change the website.
Because every now and then I'm like, it's like, you know, all right, and it's like, they find.
I mean, I can put my guitar URL.
But my question is, so like you have the API key, right?
Yeah.
So there's one in the homework this past weekend. There's one in the mall.
So when you put this in with
Do you
your,
need a header? It doesn't specify what it is.
Yeah, so that's what it is.
So do the documentation for this. All it specifies in the API call is this.
that's it. So you just, but I mean, don't you need to get
If you do the
the,
web ID,
Looks like trained as one for it's this might be.
right, now, so this is not as secure,
no, it's not, you're right.
so is that, are you thinking that where it has the API call?
Yes.
It says like at the end of the, where it says ID equals,
Yeah.
so. This is not the right one. Good. So this is just giving me for one example, so I just need to give them,
So like, this is actually work, right? You need, oh, here's the app ID.
No. Put the next one.
Okay, I see that. So this is really easy, so look, this is what you gotta do.
So we can find it here.
yeah, I have the wrong URL, I just,
Here you go. Well, for some,
So 155.
you want to do all the shit. Seriously.
I know, I wanted to try that.
Anyways, all you're needing is, and what was the API ID? Okay. I just need this, and it's include whatever your API key is. Where it was.
So who did you get the master was?
Yeah, so like, whether that's. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So it's just one thing. Search up, you can search up there.
Yeah.
Term, okay.
So,
This is completely wrong.
Oh.
like this. Okay, this is.
Oh, yeah,
So,
Yeah, exactly, so now you've got your model, step two, the next thing is you just have.
Let's do this. So,
So, but what do I put in the URL to make it? What do I put? Just the base URL, like API.whether.
you put this.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you try to just.
And just so that that's-
Yeah, but that's anyway. So
No, no,
we have to be very- Okay, hold on.
Actually, no.
He's already done that for you. Here's your city,
Yeah.
here's your country.
Oh,
It's the value
it's
or-
still the time, okay.
Now, here, I just make my URL. Okay?
Okay, so that's.
And then I just put in city, put in county, have the API key there, then just get URL, and then it's comma function, data,
So this.
and then this is how you update this is where you update the model.
I don't understand what's
Here. You just need to put this URL and then parse it out with each of the parameters. You need to make that to declare. Yeah, so basically you do this and then it's, so here's weather and then where it starts with Q, just put it there, it's doing like that. Yeah, and then, yeah, that's what you, I think that's what you're doing, like plus and then the variable, which is, you defined it
Yeah, so
earlier,
it's just like a
city.
just not like a standard.
Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. Every API will have a different way of using the API keys. They'll call it different things, and most people call them API keys.
There's like an actual comma.
This is in my JavaScript, if you use my.
Yes. Yes. That's why it's
What is, okay, what is the,
that's why it's not
the
used for
country?
other
Yeah.
like more secure applications like Facebook.
So plus,
Yeah, exactly.
comma,
It's not super secure,
Which is
it's better
straight
than
down.
Well, that's the country.
But in this case,
But
it's
it's
just like.
They did it straight on itself, so.
plus
The more
country.
users they use it, is they want to track like the number of people they're making, so if they're making a ton, they can just like.
How do you get to these?
And then the app ID, you put your, okay, so you didn't create a separate
Every
variable.
has a little difference.
It's like lazy as hell. Also, those are quotes, and so they're not variables.
Leave me alone. I'll just-
My bad.
This is all strings though, so you have to, okay, oh wait.
Okay, I want to actually start going through this up here. I know not everybody's done yet, but I want to just start up here and show you how I would have done it, because you're going to get a lot more practice on this once we start and work on the lab, okay? So let me just walk you through what I would have done. You know, if you're almost done, feel free to just keep hammering it out and ignore me, but if you're finished or if you still have a lot to go, look up here and we'll do it together. We know the first step. The first thing we need to do is we need to make an AJAX request, right? We need to make a request to this API in order to get some data. We've learned two ways of making that request so far. We can either use the shortcut methods, the $.get, $.post, or we can use the $.ajax function, which is the same thing but just has a lot more options. So in this case, like I mentioned, all of these API endpoints are GET requests. So we're just going to use $.get because that's the easiest to do. So you'll remember that $.get takes two arguments. Okay? It's always going to follow this pattern. $.get always takes these two arguments, the first of which is some URL. So I'm just putting that as a placeholder to demonstrate what this takes. The second thing that this $.get takes is what? Callback function. I heard somebody say it. It's a callback function. It's a function to run once the AJAX request has completed. It's a function to run once the AJAX request has completed. So we're always going to have this where the first parameter is a URL. The second parameter is a callback function. Okay. So instead of actually defining a function somewhere, I'm going to make this an anonymous function. And I'm going to give it a parameter called data. And we'll remember, for callback functions for AJAX requests, that parameter is the JSON body of the response for that AJAX request. So whatever data comes back in JSON from our API, that is going to be put in that data parameter. So that gives us direct access to all of that data that's inside of a response. Okay, so now we've got to figure out what is this URL. Well, let's go back to the documentation. So we know what we want is to do it like this. We want to do city and country code, because that's the inputs that we have. So we're going to make our request to api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/weather, and then we're going to have a Q query parameter, and the value there is going to be the city name from the user, comma, the city value. The country code. In addition, we also know that we need to add our app ID on there, which it doesn't really tell you here. I don't like so much. But if you click one of these, what you'll see is in the address bar, it's adding that app ID as another query parameter. Okay, so it's adding another query parameter called app ID. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the code. Up here, I'm actually going to just make my URL before I make my AJAX function. So I'm going to create this URL variable, and I'm going to start it off like this. Now, what is this URL missing here already? It's missing the protocol, right? I heard somebody say it. It's missing that protocol, that HTTP://protocol. So if we try to access it like this, we're actually going to get some sort of error. So we need to add on HTTP:// to let it know to use that HTTP protocol. Okay. Now, we're looking good, all the way up until, well, we don't want to send city name literally or country code literally. What we want to send are the values that the user inserted, which we've already extracted up here. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to end this string at the Q equals. And on the next line, just to make it a little prettier, I'm going to do some string concatenation. So I'm going to add on to the end of that string the city that the user inserted, plus a comma, plus the country that the user inserted. Additionally, what am I still missing from my URL? One more thing, key piece of data. I need the API key, the app ID. And when we looked at that URL, we saw, well, we need the ampersand to separate query parameters. We need to add app ID equals, and then here you would paste your key. And I'm going to get mine. In a second. There it is. So I'm going to get my app ID and paste it there. Okay, so now I've got this URL. So I'm going to pass that as the first parameter to .get. And then this function here is going to run when that request comes back. So the first thing I need to do is update my model. Well, I know my model has all these keys. I'm just going to go ahead and copy them so I don't have to remember. So here's a little trick for you. In Sublime, you can, actually this might, yeah, that won't work. But you can hit Option, you can hold Option and drag and create multiple cursors. And here I want to type in weather dot because I'm trying to access things inside of that. So that saves me from having to type weather a bunch of times. So Option drag, and you can create multiple cursors. I then can highlight this colon because I know I have to change this to an equal sign. So I'm going to highlight that portion, Command D, and I can select all of those at once. So I highlighted the colon and the space after, Command D to select everything like it. And then I can erase that and put equal signs. Likewise, I need to replace commas. Oops, too far. Need to place those commas with colons, semicolons, rather. Okay. Now, instead of assigning empty strings here, what I need to assign is data that is inside of our data response, our JSON response. So, I know it's going to be inside of data. That's all I know right now. The way I'm going to figure this out is I have to go back to the documentation and see like what does that response look like, and where are the various parts of this response. Actually, the city we already know because the city was inputted by the user. So I can just type in city here, referring back to that variable. Likewise, the country we already know, referring back to this variable. What we don't know are these temperature things, like what is the temperature, description, humidity, clouds. So let's take a look at the API docs. Okay. Oops. So here's the a sample response. We can see down here, well, it has this main key, and that value there is an object, and that object has a temp and humidity key. So we can go and knock out those two right now. So we know it's located in data.main.temp or .humidity. Right? So because these are objects, we can access the thing at this key with dot notation. We can access the thing with that key with more dot notation. Is that a question?
I was going to say there was a section data at the bottom called parameters.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, this is right. This is actually a much nicer way to look at this. It's the same thing. It's just laid out a bit differently. So here we can see, okay, well there's a main key, and if we access main.temp, that's the temperature. Main.humidity, that's the humidity. Yeah, this is actually a lot better. Okay, let's do those two since we know how to find those two. So I'll go back to Sublime. So now we know that the temperature is located at .main.temp. We're going to go into that main object and find the thing at the temp key. Same with humidity. We know it's at data.main.humidity. Okay, let's find the last two things we're looking for are a description and the clouds percentage, I guess, whatever that is. So if we look back here, we can see, weather.description will give us the weather condition within the group. Sounds about right. And let's see if we can find clouds. Clouds.all will give us the cloudiness as a percentage. All right, let's do that. So weather.description and clouds.all.
We get to prefix all the data.
Yes, because this entire object that it's describing, right, is all one JSON object. Right? It's all one JSON object, and that object right now we've got stored in this parameter data. Right? So that whole data, all of that information that's coming back from that endpoint is all inside of this data object. And these are the various keys that are inside of that. Okay, so now we've updated the model.
Why not city and country?
Because city and country we have defined up here. Right? These are variables that come from the user's input.
Oh, okay.
So-
the other stuff is.
Yeah, I mean we could, those probably exist in the response as well, but we don't really need to because we already know them.
So is that for the unit clarifiers helps?
Mm-hmm.
It has options to switch to metric and imperial. How would you switch it? How would you choose the default?
Yeah, so that type of thing, okay, so you're right. The default for this endpoint is going to be in Kelvin, which is not particularly helpful for Westerners or actually anybody. But what we can do is we can configure this endpoint by saying, hey, instead of giving us Kelvin, can you give us like imperial, right, Fahrenheit or whatever. And the way we would probably do that is through a query parameter. Okay, so there's probably a query parameter that's called like unit or units, I'm not exactly sure what, and the value that it takes is probably either Kelvin or Celsius or Fahrenheit, or it might be like metric or imperial or whatever it is. I'm not exactly sure. But I wager if you look through that documentation, you would find a query parameter for parameterizing, which unit the response is in. All right, so now that we've got all this data, the last thing we need to do is we need to render our model. Okay. So one thing I might be tempted to do is here down on line 56, after I've done that AJAX request, I could type in my render weather function and hit, and just call it right there. I'm going to tell you that this is not going to work. Can anybody just tell me why this won't work? Other than the usual suspects. So why can't I put this render weather here, this render weather call here, outside of this AJAX callback? Why can't I do that?
Because it's asynchronous.
Exactly, because jQuery.get is an asynchronous function. That means when we get to the next line, it's not finished yet. All that's happened is it's initiated that request. Okay. So in order to be sure that we're rendering the response data, we have to make sure to do that inside of the callback. Because if not, it's going to render it before the AJAX request returns. Okay, so this function here that we've defined right here, that function runs once the request has finished. Right? This is a callback function that runs after this asynchronous request has finished. So in order to be sure that this render method happens at the right time, we need to move it inside of that callback. Okay. Okay. Let's now give this a shot. Let's see, I'll do Washington, D.C., U.S., and submit. And if we've done all of this correctly, we should see Washington, D.C., temperature. Well, notice this is not in Fahrenheit. This is in Kelvin. 69% humidity, 1% cloud coverage.
Yeah, that was display. Jacob, that's the correct temperature.
Oh, yes. Actually, it's probably not far from the truth at this point. So let's go ahead and see if we can figure out real quick before we take our last break here. Let's see if we can figure out how we can configure this to give us Fahrenheit instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look through this documentation and I'm going to look for units or like unit. Okay, so it's saying the default is units format. Okay, this looks helpful. Parameters, units, metric, imperial. And it's going to give me example. Yep, down here I can see if I want to get Fahrenheit, I can do this extra query parameter, units equals imperial. So I'll go ahead and tag that query parameter onto the end of my URL. Or I'll put it right here, URL plus equals, an and sign to separate that, and then units imperial.
Set mine up exactly like yours.
And you're calling this render weather inside the callback? I'll take a look at it in a second. All right, so now if we refresh, hopefully we'll see something that won't kill us. Washington, D.C., U.S. Submit 83.59 degrees Fahrenheit. Hopefully a little more close to the truth. Yeah.
This is not a for example, variation between D and C and the weather API required to, which is like kind of.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it depends on how smart their program is, right? If their program is really smart and it can guess what we meant, then maybe it would work. If it's not, then it wouldn't. You know? So it's really hard to say. Hopefully somewhere in their documentation they'd say, we need to make sure that the city name is in this specific format, right? And that may be something that they specify in their API documentation. But they, not that I saw, so we're just gonna assume that they can accept any input. And we haven't built in any validation here, right? We're not verifying that they've even typed anything in, which is something we might do if this were a real application. Okay, let's take another quick break and then we'll get started on the lab just so we are starting to think about it before next class when we're really gonna dig into it.
So I got this making a call.
That's right.
So like, there's weather variables from scratch. Yeah. So, country farm, assuming the city is out.
So like, talk about somehow.
Well, take a look at the template. Now, this is not this because this isn't like default template. Here, look at the template.
Oh.
It's just seeing it.
So because of their cities. Okay, I will cheat that, just call it. Ah.
Yeah.
When you were filling this in, the Washington DC showed up under exact description before, or did zeros out?
No. I when I was making this for the class, like creating it, I typed it in, and so my browser remembered it.
Okay.
This version. You might be actually supposed to go.
What's this? Oh yeah.
Oh,
It's this here. Sorry.
Data.
well, that's so much easier.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that system was called Imperial.
Yeah.
I thought that was standard Kelvin.
I don't know. I think they just like for their API, if you just leave it off entirely, it's Kelvin.
It's Kelvin.
And if you put imperial, it's Fahrenheit. If you put metric, it's Celsius.
Okay.
So I guess Celsius is technically part of the metric system.
I guess that makes sense. I guess I assumed that's used Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit was standard because
Yeah. Well, it's just like inches, and those measurements are also imperial measurements.
Oh,
So it's
okay.
us
Oh, okay.
and
I didn't know
the
that
UK.
was called Imperials.
Yeah.
It's just like standard
It's part
system.
of like the crown.
Yes.
Got it. Okay.
It's weird.
It's really.
Yes, we should be.
I think I might be doing something wrong. The render weather, is that supposed to be, I'm trying to do the Ajax, this notation,
Yes.
This is right.
So yes, you're 90% really there, but you're having the same issue that we had when I talked about this up here. When is that render weather going to be called?
That's going to be called in the is it going to be in the guess?
Oh, exactly. So it's going to be called as soon as the Ajax call is initialized, but not when the
How
Ajax
about
call.
this function though? I created a higher order.
Oh, you created another function.
Function, should I remove that?
You don't have to, but you do have to call it something.
So I have to, do I have to call it under?
Yeah,
Is it weird?
you've got some weird indication.
I know, I was just.
So, I mean, I'm just seeing it's going to treat this window weather is hanging out outside of this function.
Okay, so it has to be.
Yeah, because
It has to be
outside of that function is an object, right? So you can't just like call a function. Right? So,
Okay, so but it needs to be part of the yeah.
yes,
That's
exactly.
so in here.
Yeah, exactly. So right after you update the model, then you call it.
Okay. Oh, okay. So okay. Yeah.
This
Okay.
is still not assigning. This is still not assigning the object data. That's the first one, and it's like, fuck, what's it?
Oh, I think mine's undefined too. Now I'm thinking about it. So I don't know if you're seeing the description. So I must be getting the wrong.
So,
You might have to refer back to the objects.
well, I couldn't find it this time, honestly. So here's the object.
Oh, yeah, look at weather. Weather's an array.
Whether or
That's
not,
the issue.
whether,
Look at those debugging tools.
yeah,
Yeah. Because I use jQuery.get instead of jQuery.ajax.
Oh, I see.
So get is like a shorthand version of obviously just the URL and call them just parameters. Whereas Ajax is a long so it has objects, this option, this object. We have the URL option, we have the success option, we have the method.
Is it 10?
It's the same thing, it's just a longer form version.
Oh, yeah.
it's on my
For instance,
It's yes.
I see.
Is your temperature or is this what you have to do? Why is it saying it's undefined?
Yes.
Something wrong with your
anytime you make a constant question, then you might have to go to
The city, I'm not sure.
Okay, let's go ahead and start talking about the lab. If you want to, keep working on this, like after I introduce the lab, just to make sure you've solidified this, that's totally cool. You can do that. But I do want to introduce the lab so that people can start working on it and thinking about it before Thursday. We're going to really spend a lot of time on it. Okay, so the lab that we are going to be doing over the course of this week is for an application that I've called Feeder with no E before the R. It's a cool name. Yes, very hip startup name. And what this application is, just generally speaking, it's just a news feed, but it's one that it's a news aggregator, but it's one that allows us to log in and bookmark articles and, save our preferences of what categories of articles we like. So this is a pretty sophisticated application. And what I've tried to do here is to create a scenario that is very similar to what you might encounter as a professional JavaScript developer. Okay? What you're going to get are two key pieces of information. And there's this whole introduction about what your job is. But you're going to get two key pieces of information. You're going to get what I call a front-end mock from a designer or another front-end developer. That's basically HTML and CSS that looks the way it's supposed to, but is non-functional. So it doesn't actually do anything, but it looks the way that we want our application to look. So you can see articles, you can see categories, you can see the login form and stuff. But whenever you try to interact with it, nothing will happen because there's no JavaScript that backs this application. It's just a mock of what the application should look like. So you're going to receive that from one team member. From another team member, say you're a backend developer, you're going to receive some API documentation. Okay? So you'll receive a list of endpoints and resources that you can use to interact with to actually bring this mock to life and turn it into a real application. Right? So let's take a look at what these things look like. I'm going to go ahead and send this link to you. It's in the slides, but I'll also send it in Slack. It's in the general channel. So we've got a few things here. Let's take a look. The first thing we'll look at is the front-end mock. Okay, so this is just the index.html file. What you'll notice is there's a bunch of HTML in here, but it's non-functional. So you'll notice, like, for instance, here's an article, right? There's a bunch of articles, but if we wanted to like bookmark this or something, nothing would happen yet. So we can open this up and we can see what it should look like in the browser, and we can use this maybe as like the basis for a template or templates. Okay, another thing that we've been given is some API documentation. All right, and so this should look pretty familiar now. What we're going to have is a list of resources. So the first one is sort of a login resource. So this is how the user can log in. You use an endpoint /login. You have to add a request body with a username, and the response body will return an ID. This is not super sophisticated login, right? There's no password or anything, but the general idea is there. This one we won't worry about yet. We're going to add this after we have a completed application. We're going to let people log in using Facebook, but we'll add that on later. And the next thing you'll see are a bunch of other resources that users have. So here's the interests resource. So we can get a user's interests. It takes a query parameter, their user ID, the one that we got when we logged in. And the response is going to be an array of strings, the strings being their interests. We can create a new interest, or in other words, put another thing in that list by submitting a post to interest / the name of the interest. So interest / science, right? Would add a science interest into that array. And when we get it back, we would see the modified interest list. We can put interests. Here we can replace the whole interests array by making a put request to /interests, and in the body, making the body an array of interests. And the response will just give us right back what we sent to it. Finally, we can delete an interest from the user's interests by submitting a delete request to that. And for instance, if we did delete request to /interests science, when we came back, we'd see that array, but the science interest would be missing, would be gone. Okay, and there are more resources. Here's the feed resource that has like an actual article object in it, or article objects, I should say. There's a bookmarks resource, and that's it. Now, there's a lot of endpoints in here. You won't have to use them all. So figuring out which ones you'll need to use is going to be part of the challenge. Okay. Finally, the last thing that I've given you here is a working version of this application that you can kind of use for reference. And so this is what it should look like when eventually we make it work. So here the user can log in. Again, this is not sophisticated logging and authentication with passwords and such, but it is what it is. So we're going to hit login. And when they log in, they should get this list of interests up here and a list of articles for their interests. Okay? So if I click news, well, that's going to add the news-related articles to my interests. If I add politics, all of a sudden I'll see, politics articles. And also, if I click one of these, I can bookmark it, and I should see this bookmark thing here on the right-hand side update. And so now if I refresh this page, I should be able to log back in, and I should see, okay, here are my 3 bookmarked articles. My interests are the same. Everything is the same as when I left it. Okay, so this is what it should look like. Play around with it, see what it looks like when it's working. All right. So let's get started on this together. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to fork this repository. So we're going to do this setup section here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to fork this repository. So go up to the top, and like we do for homeworks, just go ahead and click that fork button.
Second time, right?
Yes, this is the second lab. All right, once you've got that fork, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clone. So make sure you're on your fork page, and you're just going to take this so you can clone it. Hit that green clone button, get that URL. And then I'm going to go to the terminal. I'm going to CD so that I'm in my home directory. I'm going to CD into documents. Oops. And here, I'm going to get clone and then paste the URL of your fork. So that URL you copied from the green button, get clone, and then paste that right here into the terminal. So once again, to clone something, make sure you're on your fork and not mine. Hit this clone, copy this URL, and then get clone and the URL. And I'm doing it inside of my document, so it puts in there with all the rest of my code. And I can hit enter. If I do an ls now, I'll see it created a folder with the name of that repository. So now that I have that, I'm going to CD into that feeder directory. Okay. Okay, so not only did our backend developer give us the API docs, well, they also just gave us the code so we can run it ourselves locally, okay, which is pretty handy for us. So here are the instructions for us to run the feeder server locally so that we can interact with it, okay? So now that we've done this step 1, we've changed directory into the feeder directory. The next thing we need to do is we need to install the server's dependencies by running an npm install in the terminal. So we're going to type in npm install. So remember, npm is what's called Node Package Manager, and this is how Node projects, like the server, can require other libraries to use them. And it just so happens that the server for feeder needs a couple external libraries in order to work. So we'll go ahead and npm install, and you should see some stuff happen. And with all of us doing it at once, it's destined to take a while.
Then we can go to localhost 3010, right?
Once we start it, yeah. And so now that we have all of those dependencies installed, now we can start the server by typing in node and then the server file, which is feeder.server.js.
Did you create this file?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Are
if
we expected to learn how to create?
no, that's sort of outside the scope. We gotta tackle one thing at a time here. If you are interested, take a peek around in the server file and see what's going on in there. But no, you're not expected to understand that. That's why it has an API, so you don't have to understand it, right? The API is, my contract with you on how the server should work. Okay, so now I'm going to type in node feeder server, and when I hit enter, that should start the server. And notice that $sign doesn't come back, because now this program's running and this terminal window is not going to return until I stop the server. So I'm just going to have to leave this terminal window here running while I'm developing. If I need to do something in the terminal, I might open a new window, say. So it's saying server is listening on 3010. That means port 3010. Okay, so remember when we talked about URLs, we talked about that you can add URLs ports on the URLs by having that colon number. And the default one is what? 80. Yeah, the default one is 80. Just so happens that 80 is generally taken. So this server runs on port 3010. Now, another thing that we need to know is you can access your computer as opposed to another host by typing in localhost. So localhost, that word means my computer, my host. Okay? So on my computer, I can access our server by going in the browser to http://localhost. And we don't need a .com or anything like that. Localhost by itself means my computer. And then I can append onto that :3010 to say I want to go to port 3010. Now if I just hit enter here, what you should see is the mock for our application. So it's going to look good. It looks pretty, good is maybe overstating it, but it looks okay. This is how it's supposed to look. But when we try to interact with it, right, nothing happens. Right? It's non-functional. So our job is to take this non-functional mock here and make it functional. Okay? And we're going to do that by writing some JavaScript. So let's go ahead. If you, in your terminal, hit Command T, you can open up a new tab. Because remember, we have to leave this server running now. So Command T or maybe Control T on Windows to open up a new terminal window or terminal tab. And now I'm going to subble dot in order to open this up in Sublime. And it opened it up over here.
How did you get that localhost?
Get what?
What makes it a process?
How did I get there? You just type in http://localhost. And then, we know it's on port 3010, so we need to specify port 3010. So this is saying, find the program running on my computer, on my host, at port 3010, which happens to be that node program running in our terminal. All right. So now that we've got this opened up in Sublime, we'll notice there's a bunch of stuff going on in here. Here, this index.html, this is our mock. Okay, our non-functional mock here. This is what we're going to update for our HTML. And then in the JS folder, there's an app.js file, and it's empty. So this is where we really have to write our code in order to make this application happen. Okay, I know this probably seems a bit daunting as a task generally. The important part is, we can take this very big problem and we can sort of break it down into smaller steps or to smaller concerns, say. So a good way to attack this potentially is maybe I take a look at the HTML. I see, what things are repeated or dynamic, like in our application, and maybe can we turn this mock into HTML templates, right? So can we turn these into handlebar templates? Maybe one for the articles and one for the categories, say, just things of that nature. So maybe can I take this HTML and turn it into templates so that it can be more dynamic and not this static mock page that it is now. So that may be the first thing I do. Another thing that I could do first or second is, can I create a model that has all of this data that may be coming from the server? So can I look at the API documentation and construct a model that reflects the data I will be getting back from the server? Once I've constructed that model, I can just put fake data in there, not even worry about making HTTP requests yet. I'll just put some fake data in there, and then I'll make my model and my view work together and say, hey, view, render this fake data. Okay? And then I can see, okay, now I know how to render my model. And then once those things are working, then maybe I start working on, okay, let's wire up some event listeners, let's make some AJAX requests and actually put some real data in here. Right? So we can break this down into sort of smaller chunks and look at it one thing at a time. And each of those chunks can be subdivided, right? Like, okay, making templates, let's just make a template only for an article, right? An article. And then can we make a template that works for all of the articles? Or can we make a render function that will render all of the articles, et cetera, et cetera, okay? So I want you to attempt to get started on this on your own. Use previous things that we've looked at, use that same model view controller structure, those render functions, handlebars, templates, all those things that we've learned up to this point. We're going to put them together into one big app. So we'll spend, the rest of the time just getting started on this, and then, next class we'll probably spend the entire class finishing this up. Before we go, I didn't ask this, but before we get started, are there any questions about the assignment or general concerns? Yeah.
My node server's not working.
Okay. Anybody else's node server not working? Okay. Sweet. Okay, I'll come around and help you guys out.
Oh, you changed the port.
Freaking 10, 11.
Yeah. Do you? Is this a working computer? Is this what you need to do is update to the newer version. So you want at least 4, 5, 6 of the you can just Google.
It's like got a whole packet from Costco.
I know a thing or two about
First,
What?
that is very tough. It's hard to keep it.
Yeah.
I think it's borrowed here, like, everyone number company.
You render go back to the parts. Yeah,
Yeah, I know.
So you should make changes. Or if you're testing things, like in the library, so you're having like science.
As a first step, spend a couple weeks.
You're adding.
But not impossible. It's not that far from here, right?
I assume you not Yeah, I hate having it in the index of HTML.
Wow.
Just make it better. Because it just doesn't. See it somewhere else.
Sure.
That's my.
Well,
It's messy. Like that's the thing on here. This, I'm just not gonna do this.
Yeah, we can try that. You guys have
Article. I'm just gonna take this and
See, I'm just like, he has this article right here. He wants us to turn that section into.
I'm just gonna see here. I'm just thinking creating.
Yeah.
And this would be like the title. Yeah, so I'm taking all the.
Yeah.
Where is it gonna take the section?
I don't like where the key is there.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing
I
that.
got a question.
Sure.
How do you know? You have to paste it in.
Oh, I'm probably doing it.
No, but I'm saying once you have the template type.
Yeah.
So you can't post the template multiple times. Well, why would it? You already defined what one article works. So it's only going to ever update one article.
Oh, really? I guess, yeah, that's why I don't know enough about it. I thought you can do it for you. You have to do it beforehand. Like if.
Put all of that data, like article data.
Oh, I guess you can.
JavaScript, and
Yeah.
it runs through there.
Yeah, for each video.
Well,
Yeah.
Like for all articles, quote.
how did you do that?
We did it to be an object. And then there you based off of parameters.
Okay, yeah, let's try this.
Oh, he did a.
When you have in some-
If there's a city. Regular.
Yeah. So, but we did this for which assignment?
So,
The calendar. And then for the class, I've also put some labels.
Oh, I see. No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, it's just hard.
It's so good. And then for body. So I don't know. I need to look at the API that you have.
You're so good at this. You're really good at this. No, really, shut up.
So you really are
So just when it comes to actual JavaScript, that's what I'm like. The
Use for shit.
yeah. It's spatial reasoning. Otherwise, so we have username. So username is like politics. Yeah. Oh no, those are the API tables. So what's the city? Here we go. So really, even now we have the response body, all the different. Right. So we just basically have. Then also, yeah, once you just the data is sort of
Why are you doing the class?
So what information do you have about this one? Yeah,
Here.
what?
Just here. You're a gator.
I'm just saying, like, what, oh, the image, so the image is a URL. So we just need to. Yeah, so we just have to post, the work came to stuff. So it's from national. Yeah. So, category as well. There's an all data which you have to so what's a good one show?
Yeah, this is like the weeks.
Yeah. Right. So we want to say that that's what I'm saying. Something good. Where do you already know that? Yeah, I know. I think I would put it in the beginning just to make sure. Yeah, so I'm just oh, I just basically copied it. And then I just
Well, sure.
Yeah. Alright.
That's one.
So speaker.
Don't you dare. Don't you dare.
Or like host a site where I can add songs to it, and then maybe like add
This should be like.
maybe the background changes.
Yeah, I like the latter more, simply because like a portfolio site, you can find like pretty much information site, but it's not one lot of like interaction with a shaken state visits. That's where applications get interesting, is when I go visit it and I come back later and some state is being saved and one comes from one.
also.
It's kind of smart world, I guess. Yeah. Yeah,
Sure.
sure. More fun. I mean,
I
always wanted to.
It's like,
Right.
oh, this, oh, that's.
I mean, that's really like.
I got my.
We haven't even talked about this.
Well, we're at the point
But see, here's the thing, it's just one, perhaps you have a portfolio site where your individual items have a page. Users can like put comments.
I made the article.
But how about that?
Oh, yeah,
Then I also had yeah, so it's kind of
First one, I just wish you to make it.
yeah, and so I wanted to be out of town next week. I think you sound really good. Yeah. Like, yeah, it did. Like, pretty cool.
Feel free to hit one side.
yeah,
Yeah, so
there are multiple sources.
Make sure you're putting
Look at the server.
and you're
That's very box power, and then I'll go to add it.
Alright, cool, thanks. Cool.
And then the art app.js.
You wanna add handlebars?
I did, I just did it.
yesterday.
Just to tell them that I'm
We're gonna hide it.
Yeah.
I don't
Because I
know.
don't know what that's gonna be a single screen that I want to make that I'm to get that article. I'm always
Oh,
We gotta this through. His example is like a billion.
But he said that we don't have to.
So we
Okay. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind you, if you haven't given me your project idea, your final project idea, please do that like tonight or at least tomorrow, because I want to know what you're working on. I don't need like a 4-paragraph proposal or whatever. Just like a general idea is fine, and just like a Slack message is cool. However you want to give it to me, or you can email me. My email address is floating around. Either of those things works, but I do want to know what you're working on so I can know if it's like overly ambitious or not ambitious enough, etc. I can give you some guidance maybe. So please do get that in. Yes.
Are there any portfolios that we can look at, for example?
There are. I posted one. General Assembly has like a gallery of previous projects. Specifically look at like the WDI projects, the Web Development Immersive projects. That's a good inspirational jumping off point.
Okay.
All right, cool. So before you leave, as always, I would love it if you just filled out the exit ticket. And after that, you are welcome to leave.
You should have included forever as in your taking packet updates on it, just like forever.
Yeah. But I figured, we haven't talked about that. We have talked about running a node file. So this would make sense.
You were talking to people battery. Because then that's the battery.
Well, some processes are pretty battery intensive too.
How do you turn it on?
Control C.
Control C.
Or you can close the tab.
But I don't want to like take my computer back
I'm just rabble
home and
around.
it's just like
Just
constantly.
browsing rabbles.
I use Delp for running
Yeah.
task runners. I have like 3 task runners running at the same time. It's really good.
Yeah, I do too.
You do it for SAS.
We use it as like a test runner. It runs a build tool. It runs a research tool.
Do you ever use natural?
Speaking to yeah, we use resources to build it up.
It's sad I know all these things, but I'm so bad at coding.
Oh,
Thank you. Fun fact, nobody knows how to open this file. I taught myself how to do that, but my fellow developers were like, what? You just copy and paste and
You can find a Go file online.
yeah, you can find one, like, no one actually built that stuff.
Yeah, well, actually, I built a very simple one because I was the most basic, like,
Yeah.
this says, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Or like, I redefine my JS, and it's already there already online, so you just, you can plug it in, I didn't like.
Our Go file like gives you desktop notifications if your code fails. So it just like continuously runs, and as you code, you can save
And you're like,
it, and it breaks to give you a desktop notification.
But then going to terminals, when it pops up, it's like, what is wrong with you? Your SAS is wrong.
Your server is quite highly useful. It's exactly what I need to, I already installed a server public, and that's how you keep the authentication file in all 4 floors on it's not the same directory or outside the public directory. You can still access it from the node server, right?
Yeah.
Call it as the Swire inside.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And then
You definitely want to keep like sensitive like server code outside of the public campus. You don't want
but even if you're requiring that function, can't they still cut the keys inside that function?
because it's all running on the back end. So it's never making its way onto the top.
So that function's just gonna appear empty.
They won't see that function at all. If you're going to call it on the back end, they're going to see the results.
So the variable is just the result.
So the file that you're requiring it into,
Yeah,
that's the server file that you're running on the back end.
yeah.
So the server is perfectly aware of all the code involved there.
Oh,
But it's never done.
yeah, but so the okay, so yeah, whatever it displays. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So can you talk more about REST? Which is the response of the app get call on the functions? And like I noticed that you can only use it once, otherwise it'll say.
Oh, okay. You're talking about response.
Yeah, or throw an error.
Yeah. So what's happening when you actually like start doing to it? It's like writing that out to HTTP as you do it. So as soon as you start writing it, you can't take that back. So it's
Right.
already done.
Right. So you can only also do it once. I noticed if you do two rest hands right after each other, they're like,
Yeah, exactly. Because remember, every request, you only have to see it. That's how it is.
right.
So if you try to do it twice, it doesn't know what it's
So you better get all your shit and then put it in one JSON object and send that shit back.
You gotta like get a rest file.
So probably what we were saying basically is like, every time we're making a HTTP request, we can only have one response. So if you want to send a bunch of data, you have to compile it into one sort of JSON.
You like to go boss?
I am sad.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's so well, we did, and then we someone and then they could revert to
Yeah, I feel fine like when you do those sort of like big faculty projects, it often ends up in this like half it's almost stress.
Yeah, like I'll look at the ones with like 5 fields.
Yeah, and that's
like this is not right. This is not right. Like I think it's terrible.
Confirm password. Confirm password. Confirm
But
again.
it's just like.
This is like, I mean, coming into the JSON, you know, I don't know, they're just,
Yeah.
just.
Yes.
Great, I said, I just want to let you know, I submitted assignment 6. I did say, like, I did 5 of them alone. I think so.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're starting to get familiar with those tools, that's what's important. Like, you're gonna need them for this.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I feel like,
Awesome.
No, they had a few things, they had like.
See, there's a-
I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
So, do you have your weatherify thing open?
Yeah, probably after this. Okay.
I was confused. You might be able to explain this without us looking at it, but why why you have to include the render weather within the object itself?